I just got my testament from the University of Sydney, and so I invited Dr. Humberstone here today because we haven't really talked about our work in public. So I thought it'd be really timely, given that it's legit now, right, to talk about it. So what it was, this is my thesis. And interestingly, it didn't start out this way, but this is where we ended up. For about 3 years, I think I was going to do a study on my work at the school I was employed at the time, but I didn't. I pivoted. And then, so this is it, writing the wonky donkey of evidence-based practice, resisting the neoliberalization of education through active work in the music classroom. And just wanted to talk about a couple of things. So here it is, and I'll just scroll to the top.
Can we point out it's free to download?
Yes.
And thanks to Brad's title, if you can remember Brad Fuller, which is Brad's name, and Wonky Donkey, that's enough to actually get you to his PhD thesis on Google.
It's very handy. Yeah, and it just comes up there.
Yeah.
So, interestingly, there's a nice dedication there that none of my family, if you're watching, none of them have read they won't even read the acknowledgement. So my wife talked to me about evidence-based practice, and she said, I've got this book. And I said, wow, we've started to talk about evidence-based practice in schools. And she said, I'll give you the book. And I opened this up, and I saw that there was a stool, and all I'd ever heard about was this thing, best evidence. And then when I read this book, I went, whoa, there's clinical expertise. Another word for that would be practitioner, practitioner expertise. And then instead of student, insert student characteristics. And that blew my mind. And in education, we hadn't heard about anything other than the evidence. And at the time, the bosses I was working for would come in and say, this is the way we're going to roll from now on because this is what works best. And I just thought, is it? And nobody seemed to question that this was what works best, or that indeed that, and interestingly, what works best seemed to be at odds with what was working really well for me and Pete and our students in our classroom. And and so when I read this and went, there's clinical expertise. And then I'd look at the students and go, you guys are having the best time ever, aren't you? And then, but they weren't appearing in this education evidence-based practice. So
for context, Brad, can you just tell us what your wife does? Because I think then people will really understand how you get from there to where you're at.
That's a really good point. So my wife, Dr. Alison Fuller, is in charge of music therapy education at the Western Sydney University. And she's been a music therapist since the 90s. And I never understood. And so really interestingly, we're going to write a paper shortly and about how music therapists were all concerned about not doing education, and music educators were all concerned about not doing care. And it's just been very interesting to see that over the last little while, lots of people in music education have been more interested in care, and lots of people in music therapy have been less hung up about, is this therapy or is it education? So there's a convergence coming there, which I think is really cool.
Yeah.
So my wife and I talk a lot about what often feels like we're talking about the same thing. And I think it makes lots of sense, right? That
so you're sort of translating, when you say clinical expertise and practitioner expertise, you're translating that medical idea to your situation as a music teacher.
Yes. And nobody was. And so that's the thesis, essentially. But then I found out that context was, and this, I'm quite proud of this, I took this stool and stuck an extra leg on it in Keynote, I think.
And took a thumb out.
Took the thumb out, yes, which might have just been a crop, I think. Yes. So context, where are you? So it's like there's evidence, but who are you? Who are they? And where are you? And so that was really the catalyst, wasn't it, James, about that got us off and running.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, how something that actually has been discussed for decades in clinical settings and other areas didn't seem to have been discussed so much in education settings, and definitely not in music education settings. So even though you were drawing on sort of research literature that was really clearly established, this was all brand new for the music education field.
Which was good, right? In some ways.
Which is good because it's a PhD. Contribution to the knowledge.
Yeah, bad that people were walking around feeling quite sad, but then not so bad because, yes, as you said. So the other thing that might be of interest is this isn't a traditional thesis. And so I don't know, was this one of the first theses of this type, James?
The first one ever through the Sydney Conservatoire.
That's pretty cool. And as a result of James I just popped off Peter's name. As a result of your support. So this is a thesis structure which I adapted. It was really cool. So my wife and I, Al, did and studied at the same time. And so we'd go and have coffee and talk about things, and sometimes she'd get ahead and sometimes I'd get ahead. And so she actually published this first in her thesis, and then I adapted it for mine. So the idea is that it's a thesis by publication, but at our university we call it a thesis with publications. And the idea is that you publish as you go. So 4 papers and with an introduction and a coda. So the idea was to look at this problem, resisting neoliberalisation of education through active work in the music classroom, look at the problem globally, and then look in a New South Wales perspective and look at a personal perspective, me. And then the final paper was talking about the very thing that led us to be here today, actually, this idea of community of practice and what can we do as a group to resist this neoliberalisation, which in the thesis, I argue, has kind of the outworking of it all is control through evidence-based practice, when I call it a neoliberalised evidence-based practice where it's just the evidence, everything else has been wiped out, and nobody talks about the practitioners, the teachers and the students and the context. So a first for the Conservatoire in education, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually already a completely different model for upcoming students. So Yuhang Zhang, who just passed her Masters of Music, looking at how teachers how music teachers pivoted to online teaching during lockdown in Australia. So that's that has passed. I can say that publicly. That has passed and will be published in the next month. But she is literally the same day she received notification from the university that she had passed. She was looking at page 37 of Dr. Brad Fuller's thesis as a model for her own PhD. And I think it's actually going to be really interesting, Brad, that now that you've created this model and done such a strong job, to see what other future researchers do with it. Because as you said, you were sort of changing through the first 3 years of yours, and there was some sort of rewriting and rethinking that you had to do to end up with the format that you did. So it'll be interesting if Yuhan is successful in her application to see how a thesis with that exact plan from the start works out. So she's planned 3 case studies. You've got 4 papers there. She might end up with 3 or 4 papers, but yeah, a very deliberate write out right from the start. And I, you know, it's completely new at the Sydney Con, but as we know, it's the common way of doing things in other countries, such as our friend and colleague Alexis Kallio told us in Finland at the Sibelius Institute in Helsinki. They produce. Oh, I'm Peter again. Good. Where they've got a whole team, a huge number of PhD students in a really big music education school, and that's the standard way of doing things. But yeah, I think your model's going to be really fantastic for music education at the Sydney Con.
That's really cool. And so I think also I'm really excited about it for practitioners as well, because I took it on as a practitioner and then stopped being a practitioner in the classroom. But I'm hoping that because you're publishing and writing papers, I think this was an incredible vehicle for action research and practitioner research in the classroom as well. So there you go. That's what I've been up to. And just a couple of other things. So this might help a little bit. So 4 research questions. So there's this thing called the Global Education Reform Movement. And so the first question was, what's the impact of the Global Education Reform Movement on education policy in New South Wales? And then the outworking of the Global Education Reform Movement is essentially this document called What Works Best. And so that led me to research question 2, are the themes, practices, strategies, which I call the TPSs, of high expectations and explicit instruction suitable for implementation in the music classroom. So starting to narrow it down. So we're looking about global education reform, which tends to come as a back to basics approach and is driven by standardized tests like NAPLAN, but on the end like PISA tests, and then narrowing it down to New South Wales, and this idea that what works best is to teach students explicitly and to have high expectations. And so I interrogated that, and that was coming out of my personal experience as a classroom music teacher who wasn't doing well, who was doing loads of explicit instruction and had high expectations for my students, but just not in the way that people seem to be reading this What Works Best document. So that was that. And then what is the impact on the What Works Best document on secondary classroom music teachers? Me. And so I published a paper in the Australian Music Education Journal. And then this one is where James and I came into the whole thing. This one was based on James's MOOC. And so we had 6,500 teachers to draw on. And we looked at the change in their worldview as they engaged in this community of practice that James had put together. So future additional research and publications planned. James, how about that? Oh yeah, I forgot.
We're going to write a book, folks.
And hopefully there'll be some people here that can get involved. And just last thing, this is the musical model that my wife and I, Al, developed in 2022. And I just wanted to, so you might be thinking, oh man, I haven't got time to read a thesis, and that sounds really boring. But the cool thing is that here's the paper, paper 1, paper 2, and paper 3, and paper 4. And in the middle, I was able to tell stories. And so my stories might be of interest to you. So these interludes, there's a prelude and an interlude for each of the papers where I give personal context and draw from a range of sources and stuff. I found it to be an incredible experience, transformative. And yeah, so there you go. And I offer
I would
it now.
also strongly recommend from the point of, not from the point of supervisor or anything, but anyone who sort of has discomfort. I've had another honours student who talked about why music teachers don't stick in music teaching. And it's quite interesting because it seems like we are so different that actually the wider research about why teachers do and don't stay in the classroom doesn't necessarily exactly apply to us. Quite often, our problems are things like not being respected or given very much priority by our leadership, not being part of a very big department, not being mentored, not having, friends who we're teaching alongside because we might be the only teacher or one of only two teachers. Those kind of things, rather than necessarily things to do with behavior management. Obviously, that is, in some schools, that is a big problem. But anyway, I think that on that front, if you find yourself sitting in staff meetings as people are being told how to do things like explicitly teach and things that don't really seem to apply to music, the second paper of Brad's, which he could really spoil the answer just by because you can answer the research question in a yes/no, is a great one for encouraging us to think critically and actually, go with that feeling of discomfort. And sort of realizing that, maybe some of the big top-down things that come from the Department of Education or from NESA, even if you're teaching in an independent school or a Catholic school, some of the stuff that filters down into our music curricula, into our music classrooms, isn't really intended for us. It's big, broad, general stuff that maybe works in big, broad, general ways. Obviously, all education has this big literacy, numeracy, there we go, has this big numeracy, literacy focus. And, that's absolutely fine, except for the fact, of course, that before we got NAPLAN here in Australia and before we really started leaning into that focus in the late 2000s, that there was already 15 years of research in Europe showing that explicitly leaning into that didn't improve outcomes, which is exactly what we've discovered after 10 years of NAPLAN here. Anyway, I don't want to get too political on the whole NAPLAN thing, but the great thing about this research is that it gives you, as I say, a perspective for critically looking at that feeling that you might just have, that I had. I was a classroom teacher for 12 years before I went to the to train future music teachers. And lots of the professional development that I did as a whole school or things that came up in staff meetings were fantastic and inspiring. And I had some really wonderful colleagues from different faculties. And I was lucky to be part of a very big music department, so certainly didn't have any shortage of mentoring. But in addition to that, there's always stuff that comes down the tube, and it's come directly from ministers, and it just doesn't work. Music is so different to other subjects that it just doesn't work. So I really would recommend that as quite an easy and fun read to kind of provoke critical thinking and give you some armament for pushing back next time the head of Kappa says to you that you need to be doing more numeracy and literacy in your music classes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there was a moment, wasn't there, James, where I think one of the bosses said, well, go away and read something. And I went, I'm going to go away and read everything. and it took a while. And in order to read everything, I had to quit my job. And so I don't think it would be prudent for everybody to read everything and quit their job. So I did, and here it is. I've published it, and it's the thesis I wish I could have gone to at that point where the bosses said, this is what works best, and this is evidence-based practice. If I could have just popped off and downloaded this thesis for free, then I think my life would have been drastically different. And I hope yours will be too, because teaching inauthentically, teaching in a way that doesn't feel right, is not cool. It's uncool. And turns out that there's room. And that's why Bradagogy, the Bradagogy podcast was so important to me, because I think Bradagogy picks up on the work that I did here, James, talking about if teaching is a science, then it is simply this is what works best. Go and do what we tell you to. But if the only thing you've got is no, teaching's art, well, you can't speak to the science people if all you've got is no, teaching is an art. But I really love this notion of teaching as a craft in that dynamic intersection, because it says, yes, I'm interested in the evidence, I'm interested in the art, and I blend it all in the middle. And that's the craft of teaching. So, and again, that would have been helpful to know 10 years ago.
And I think also to know that here in Australia, we're dealing with a particular flavour of that. I don't know whether you have to finish bang on 5, but I was just going to mention the fact that in other countries around the world where they have models for evidence-based practice, that one of the whole points is that the evidence base is brought to you from independent research centres, people who are employed by universities and go and work in schools, so that it can't just be evidence that is made to fit whatever ideology the government has bought into at the time. And the other advantage of having it done by independent academics is that they'll tell you what it is and isn't applicable to. So you can read, that an idea like direct instruction, for instance, might be extremely useful for learning about the number ladder, or learning about a particular processes for reading or spelling and things like that, but may not actually be particularly useful for learning how to play the trumpet or learning how to play chords on a guitar, which are best learned by copying and repeating. And so I think that we've got a really weird model here, and I think that you and I've got more work to do on that to help people unpack it, but
It's incredibly exciting, though, isn't it? Because it's just wonderful to, and we talk a lot about the cats at GBL. It's wonderful to go to the cats and say, hey, guys, what's going on? And they go, well, there's this really cool stuff. And it's okay. You can be imaginative. You can be creative. You can be caring. You can be loving. You can be plural. And it's good. And it's not only good, it's good for you, it's good for your students, and it's good practice. And I think I got to sit down with Pasi Sahlberg a little while ago, name drop, and he was saying that in Finland, their people read the research and just did it. And as a result, according to Pasi, people are having a nice time in education in Finland. So that's part of our raison d'etre here at GBL, to read the research. And the other thing is, mostly bosses and people with money have time and money to access all of this research that sits behind paywalls. And thinking about that book on the shelf back there that James and I have a chapter in, which I don't think I could afford to buy. So as a result of us being in the academy, we're able to get access to these resources. And so part of our raison d'etre here at GBL is to read the literature, and package it up in a way that you don't have to quit your job and sit on a balcony for 6 years.
Bullshit.
Sorry?
Help teachers call bullshit.
Yeah, amen.